The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, does the world face a fertility crisis? Journalist John Ibbitson and pollster Daryl Bricker on why global population rates are on the decline and why we should do something about it. Then, two anti-natalists make the case against having children. That's all ahead on the agenda. Almost 6 years ago, we had on this program two authors of a book that seemed to fly in the face of conventional thinking that had existed for decades. The book, Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline. Since then, well, fertility rates around the globe have declined. And so we welcome back those authors. In the nation's capital, John Ibbitson. He's also the writer-at-large for the Globe and Mail. And with us here in studio, Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. Great to have you guys with us here on our program again all these years later. Let's start with, this is something from The Lancet. This is a Lancet study that suggests by the year 2050, more than 3/4 of countries will not have high enough fertility rates to sustain population size over time. This will increase, says the Lancet study, to 97% of countries by the year 2100. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida had this to say last year, quote, "Japan is standing on the verge of whether we can continue to function as a society." And let's get 20 seconds from the world's richest man while we're at it. Here's Elon Musk. Sheldon, if you would.
And I think for most countries, they should view the birth rate as the single biggest problem they need to solve. I mean, if you don't make new humans, there's no humanity. And all the policies in the world don't matter.
John, let's go to you first. How would you characterize the danger that population decline represents today?
It's a significant danger. We said in Empty Planet that we didn't know whether population decline was a good thing or a bad thing. We just knew it was a big thing. These years later, we now are pretty sure it's a bad thing. Great for the environment. Let's be emphatic about that. In terms of biodiversity, in terms of fighting climate change, fewer people is great for the environment. But the social and economic costs are grave. Every year, there are fewer young people available to pay for the costs of older people like me, pension costs and healthcare costs and all those other costs. They find themselves burdened, working harder, making less, paying more in taxes to look after the elderly. And as we're seeing across the world, those young people are becoming increasingly restive, unhappy with the burden that they're being forced to share, unhappy with the fact that for many of them, they'll never be able to afford to own a house, for example. And they're reacting sometimes in just by voting for conservative parties, but sometimes they're acting out more powerfully than that. Overall, I think it's not a good thing for the society that we live in or the economy that we work in to have fewer people being born.
Daryl, this is a hard thing for many of us of a certain generation to get our heads around because, of course, when we were growing up, we were told overpopulation was going to kill this planet and we needed to do something about it. Let me share some numbers with you and then I want to put a question after that. South Korea has the world's lowest birth rate at 0.68. Italy, where 80% of the people are Roman Catholic, has the fastest shrinking population in Europe. Their birth rate is 1.2. Canada's birth rate has dropped to 1.6 children per woman, from 1.6 to 1.26 in less than a decade. Help us understand why this decline is happening.
Well, it's a matter of choice. I mean, it's people have just decided that they really don't want to participate to the degree that our ancestors did in the production of the next generation. And it is a global situation. There are certain parts of the world that do have higher than replacement rate fertility, and replacement rate is 2.1, just to give people some context for those numbers that you were mentioning. So each woman in a country needs to have one for herself, one for her partner, and a little bit extra for those who can't or won't have kids in the future. And as a result of that, almost all of the developed world world is below that number. And the reason for that is because basically we've decided that we don't want to participate to the degree the way that our parents and our grandparents did in the creation of the next generation, which basically says maybe Charles Darwin was wrong in this one instance in which it's not really a competition to participate in creating the future. It's a competition not to participate in the future.
John, if it is a well thought through choice, why are we making, not we three, but I mean we as a society, why are we making that choice?
It's the result primarily of urbanization, both in the developed world and in the developing world. When you move from the countryside to the city, children stop being an asset and become a liability, from another pair of hands to work in the field to just another mouth to feed. When you move from the countryside to the city, women have access to information and education that they didn't have before. They become more empowered. And when they become more empowered, they demand control over their bodies. And when they demand and get control over their bodies, they choose to have fewer children. As well, the power of religion declines in an urban environment. The power of the clan declines in an urban environment. You're not surrounded by aunties trying to get you to marry. You're surrounded by co-workers who couldn't care less. All of those things point towards a society in which women, having control over the number of children that they can have, choose to have fewer.
Here's where I get, I'm going to go off script here and get a little personal for a second. John, I know you don't have kids. Daryl, what about you? You got kids?
One.
You got one.
Wanted more but couldn't.
So that's your story.
Yeah.
How many people do you think are in similar circumstances where they'd like to have more children, but either for cost or they couldn't or other reasons, this is what they're facing?
Well, there is, two measures of future fertility. There's the difference between desired fertility and expected fertility. And desired fertility is always higher than expected fertility. So the issue of cost absolutely does play a factor in this. But what probably plays a bigger factor is people waiting for a very long time to start their families. And since we produce the next generation in the way that we produce previous generations, when you wait a long time, the biology starts to work against you. The difficulty of finding partners to raise children together with is a really big problem. I mean, marriage rates are reducing. People are getting married older. All of these cultural things kind of come together and work against the ability of people, even if they want to have kids, and even if they're able to afford to have kids, to maybe just opt out of the situation because of the circumstances of their lives and the decisions that they've made. So yes, there is a gap between desired fertility and expected fertility, but there's really not anything that anybody's figured out to be able to close that gap.
John, you write so much about politics, so let's talk a little politics. We've had a lot of people come on this program trying to explain the political moment in which we find ourselves. What role do you believe low birth rates play in driving the political changes we have been seeing over the past decade?
I think they're contributing to something that none of us ever expected to see, which is a broad shift among millennial and Gen Z voters towards conservative parties and conservative politicians. Young people, especially young men, voted for Donald Trump in unprecedented numbers in the last American election. We know that younger voters are one of the most important cohorts driving Pierre Poilievre's popularity here in Canada. We have seen from Korea to France and elsewhere in Europe as well, moves towards conservative, even sometimes far-right political parties by young people. And I think it is simply their frustration at not being able to access the kind of opportunities that older people such as us enjoyed when we were young, and they're lashing out.
I want to ask you, Daryl, about the rate at which things are happening, because it took most of human history for our population to go from 1 billion, to reach 1 billion, but then only about 200 years to get to 8 billion. So that was massive and fast. Could the decline be just as quick?
Well, that's the part we don't know. And the one thing that John and I say about our book, which we wrote 5 years ago, was that if we underestimated anything, it was the speed at which this was going to happen. COVID was certainly an accelerator to this. The aging of the population is taking place faster, and fertility decline is taking place faster than we anticipated. And the people who do the most work in terms of tracking this, you mentioned the Lancet study, but there's also the work that comes out of the UN, every year adjust the peak population number down, and every year they move the peak population closer to the time that we're living in right now. So my view of what's going to happen on the other side of this, I mean, you mentioned all of humanity to get to 1 billion people, but another stat that might be interesting is that from 1950 to today, we've gone from 2.5 billion to 8 billion. It's happened in less than a century. So just as everything was unpredictable, a lot of things were unpredictable on the way up, it's probably going to be pretty unpredictable on the way down too, as to exactly what this is going to be. And frankly, Steve, it's great that you're having this show, because hardly anybody's really thinking about this issue these days. They're thinking about a lot of other things, but this is going to be something from a political, economic, social, any aspect of the human species that you can look at is going to be a significant issue for us as we go forward, and faster than anything I think anybody's really anticipating right now.
Well, John, in fact, a researcher from Georgetown University has said in a piece that the two of you recently wrote, this is a mental health issue, it's an infectious disease issue, it's an aging in place issue, it's a geriatric care issue. Does population decline basically insinuate itself into almost every aspect of society?
Yes, it does, including the struggle to cope with that decline. And that struggle takes several forms, and some of those forms are very unpleasant. The best way in which to respond to declining fertility and declining population, we believe, is through supports for women, enhanced parental leave, enhanced policies to, in the conventional relationship, have the husbands take part of that parental leave, enhanced daycare on site, programs that make it possible for a woman to have a child and then go back to her career without any real impairment. We might call that the Swedish model. There's another model, which we might call the Hungarian model, which is you pay women to stay home and have babies. In Hungary, it can be quite lucrative to have 4 kids. You essentially pay no income tax. We don't think that's a very good model. We think it's regressive. We think it deprives us of generations of progress in women's rights, and it's to be avoided. There are other models as well. There's a degrowth model, one that says we must simply come to terms with the fact that we are going to be a society in decline and move to a more essentially socialist way of allocating resources. Again, we don't think that gives you the kind of resources that you need to function in a modern society with healthcare and education and pensions and the like. All of these models have drawbacks. Some of them, especially those that try to restrict the rights of women, are in fact quite dangerous.
Well, Darrell, you just have to look next door at the province of Quebec. They've been, quote unquote, bribing women for generations to have more kids. Doesn't seem to be working. Can you pay women enough to stay home and have more children?
The answer is no. You can't. And it's interesting in Canada. I remember reading a headline, I think it was last summer, about the amount of money that the federal government is spending on childcare in Canada and the expansion of the childcare system over the space of the last 5 years. And over the same space, the fertility rates dropped from 1.6 to 1.3. So you might even argue that there's a negative correlation between the two things. Obviously there isn't, but the fact is it's a spurious relationship. In other words, one doesn't affect the other. People are making the decision to have smaller families for reasons other than just economic. And as a result of that, all of these well-intentioned kind of liberal technocratic solutions, getting rid of the career penalty for women, making children, almost free if you possibly can in countries. But if you take a look at the countries that have done the most in this space, not all of them have declining fertility rates. So it tends to be a bit of it's the answer we would like, but it tends to be a bit of a spurious correlation.
John, can you just sort of play it forward for us? We talked about South Korea, we talked about Japan. If those countries continue to go in the direction in which they're currently going, 25, 50 years from now, what do those societies look like?
In the most extreme case, for example, Korea could lose two-thirds of its population by the end of the century. And again, as the Japanese have said, how do you keep a society functioning when you're losing two-thirds of your population? It's a huge geopolitical issue as well, Steve, because one of the countries that's losing people every year is China. I believe they're up to about 2 million a year now that they're dropping. They have, one of the world's lowest fertility rates. We talk about an aggressive expanding China that's trying to take control of the world's economy and trying to supplant the United States as the dominant geopolitical force. My fear is exactly the opposite. Empires in decline are dangerous things. China's empire is in decline. Its population is declining. It's getting older. It has the same young, restive population that are not being afforded the opportunities they thought they were going to have. And I'm worried about what the Chinese government is going to do to lash out in an attempt to distract the population from the growing unhappiness over the results of population decline.
So does it go without saying, John, that a couple of generations ago when China decided to impose a one-child policy on all families, that was a failure?
Well, it was cruel and it was a failure, but it would have happened anyway. The funny thing about the one-child policy is it happened even as the Chinese fertility rate was declining. They would have gotten to where they are now with or without the one-child policy. The one-child policy just added misery to people's lives that wasn't necessary.
Okay, Daryl, let's talk about Canada, because our population in the last, I guess, couple of decades has gone up a lot. We're at 40 million people right now, which is an unprecedentedly big number for us. So why should we worry?
Well, we should be very, very worried, because the thing that we've been relying on in order for that to take place is immigration. And it's absolutely, I don't think this is too strong a word, tragic, the way that immigration has been played with in this country over the space, particularly of the last decade, and a consensus that existed across the political parties, across our, basically across our society to a large degree, about the desirability of immigration has been shattered. And as a result, the Canadian population is predicted to shrink over the next 2 years, because the government's had to cut back on what has been extreme immigration over the last while, and the public is not supporting that anymore. And many of our political institutions and political actors are asking questions about it now. So one of the things that we argue about state in Empty Planet was maybe Canada is an example for the rest of the world in terms of how you can smooth the decline that we're all inevitably going to go through. But the biggest variable that we had working, the biggest tool that we had working in our favor, we've basically destroyed in terms of public opinion.
Destroyed? Is that putting it too hard?
No, I think we're only seeing the initial reactions to what was going to happen around the immigration issue. I think that it's given, what's happened over the last while has given permission, because this is just a Canadian thing. And this is one of the things about this issue. It's not a Canadian thing. It's a global thing, and Canada is just participating in it. And some of the forces that we saw come to the fore that were kind of unspoken things that existed in subcultures, I think, in Canadian politics that we're seeing in places like Europe and in the United States these days are going to get a bit more of a hearing than they used to. And that, to me, that's tragic.
John, let me get you to build on that in this respect. You know, Japan is understandably concerned because they are, I think it's fair to say, wary of immigration there. Some people might even say xenophobic as it relates to immigration. We are not. In spite of what our friend Daryl here says, we've been very pro-immigration for 75 years or so, certainly since the end of World War II. If you can make the case that we need immigration in order to prevent population decline, do you think that can arrest some of the difficulties that Daryl just described?
Well, let's make a best case scenario. Let us assume that the next government, whether it is liberal or conservative, successfully reestablishes a consensus in favor of moderate levels of immigration in order to compensate for low fertility. So we get it back to 250,000 a year, 300,000 a year, something like that, something like what it was a decade ago. We still have a problem with labor shortages. We still don't have people to fill the spaces that are needed to handle all the hamburgers in McDonald's and make all the beds at the hotels. So those labor shortages are going to emerge, and that's going to create pressure to increase the intake, and that's going to create more resistance. The other problem you have is we're running out of source countries. As I said, China used to be one of our largest sources of immigrants, but China is losing population. The Philippines is another major source of immigrants. Their fertility rate has dropped well below replacement rate to their considerable alarm just in the last few years, and they're going to soon not be able to export people. And India, the world's largest country, we predicted that India would get to replacement rate towards the end of this decade. We were wrong. They're already at replacement rate. So a generation from now, India will start to lose people. We may not have sources of immigrants, even if we have the desire and the will to bring them in sooner rather than later.
Daryl, you could always depend on African nations to want people to come to Canada? Canada is seen as an attractive destination for many people who wanted to leave African countries. Not going to be the case for very much longer?
No, and in fact, we say in the book, it is really the only place in the world that has surplus population and a young population that may be interested in moving. But the problem with the African population moving is what we're talking about is something very different than the thing that created the consensus around Canadian immigration, which was the cream skimming of the immigrant population through the point system, that we were bringing in people who were going to be easily assimilated, people who were educated, people who already had jobs, and we're going to make a net contribution to the Canadian economy immediately. That's not describing the immigrant population from Africa in the main. There are elements that are obviously fitting within that category, but in the main they're not. And this is one of the problems they have with African immigration in Europe at the moment. So yes, from a pure numbers point of view, possibly, but from a desirability point of view in terms of the population's ability to assimilate and contribute immediately, that's going to be a bit of an issue.
John, I want to pick up on something you alluded to just a few minutes ago, which was the notion of China declining in size and yet being militarily strong, and what the regime over there might resort to in order to maintain their position in the world. And I want you, if you can, to kind of paint a picture of a world where that phenomenon is happening in many, many countries that were accustomed to seeing themselves as strong players in the world, but because of their declining population, maybe darker forces are afoot. What does a world like that look like?
Well, it's a dangerous and unstable world. It is a world in which China, again, facing growing unrest in its own streets by the young population, feels that it can distract them by, let's say, invading Taiwan. It's a world in which Russia, which has a declining population, very low fertility rate, decides that the best way to overcome that problem is by annexing other countries and acquiring their populations. It is a world in which there's a great deal of internal strife. Even in societies like the United States, which had immigration, which have some of it unplanned, but they have immigration, they have the same problem that we have, for example, which is tremendous trouble recruiting people. The only good news in all of this could be that countries are going to have trouble waging war because they're going to have trouble finding the soldiers that they need to wage them. But that's a best case scenario. The worst case scenario is one of growing instability around the world.
Daryl, this is a bit of an odd question, but let's try it here. If we're having trouble making our own replacements, can you imagine a world where cloning becomes a more significant phenomenon?
Well, it's interesting that you had, and actually appropriate that you had Elon Musk on at the start of this in a clip, because he's somebody who's been banging on about this. It's interesting in the United States. I mean, we heard about childless cat ladies in the election campaign. Horrible thing to say, but representative of a certain element of the American population in which the fertility rate issue is becoming, a motivating political position. And it's a combination of kind of more religiously fundamental people combined with this odd mix of people in the technology sector who are aligned with what Elon Musk is saying about this being the biggest issue facing humanity over the space of over the next century. And they're looking for technological solutions for it. Everything from extending people's ability to actually produce be able to reproduce longer term, but also looking at ways of producing people in other sorts of ways. So it seems like it's science fiction, but there are people giving this serious consideration. And I do know in the venture capital world that there's actually money going into this.
John, we do precious few programs on this channel where there are no solutions to the problems we talk about. Is this one of those shows where we just don't have a solution to this?
I think in the case of Canada, the best thing that we can do is, again, try to reestablish a consensus in favor of immigration and bring in as many people as we can in a controlled and responsible way. We also need to do everything we can to support women in the workforce so that they can have children if they want to have them. They can have them younger if they want to have them without sacrificing their careers in doing so. But look, there's a dark side to all of this, a very dark side to all of this. The people who are talking about finding solutions tend to be powerful men. And they tend to be powerful men who perhaps aren't too worried about the rights of women being circumscribed. There may be powerful men who are saying women spend too much time at school. In fact, there are politicians saying that overeducated women have trouble finding attractive men who can help them bear children. These sorts of very ugly, dark arguments that harken back to a distant past are the real danger, and you're starting to hear them inside certain elements of the conservative movements, especially in the United States, especially among the far right in Europe. They are the antithesis of feminism, and they would roll back everything that we've achieved over decades. So there are things that we can do, but there are also things we have to be very careful not to let happen.
Well, I got to ask this question then, Daryl, to you as a follow-up, particularly since we just had Margaret Atwood on the program.
I was just going to ask this.
I mean, we've got, are you saying Gilead is on the way?
You know what? Margaret Atwood, her book may at some point move from fiction to documentary. That there are elements in certain parts of the world that this is kind of their view. Maybe not in exactly the same way, but looking at the choices that women make as not necessarily being about their own bodies and their own lives, but being assets that need to be somehow harvested by the state. I don't think that's that far off the beam, given what we see happening in places like Hungary, where they've put everything in place that John talked about, basically rewarding women to do exactly what we're talking about here, but also taking over things like in vitro fertilization. They've nationalized it. I mean, Xi, in his last Women's Congress in China, ended the conference by saying, all right, this is all great. You're all here. Now I've got one message for you. Go home and have babies. So I don't know that it's that far away and that unthinkable. So I think Margaret Atwood has done everybody a great service by raising the possibility of what this could look like if we get back into some sort of a regressive kind of a situation. Now, not exactly the same way, not for exactly the same reasons and all the rest of it, but this fundamental point that we could, as John said, roll back on some of these rights that have been so important for women in the development of society and the improvement of society over the space of particularly the last century. I'm afraid of what's going to happen, and I think people should be afraid of what's going to happen.
You know, they shoot part of The Handmaid's Tale in Toronto.
In my hometown, Cambridge, Ontario.
Well, and I was going to say, I bet many of us, people watching this, listening to this, have at sometime or another seen the handmaids in their red outfits in the streets of Toronto, shooting scenes for the show, and doing a double take, thinking, what in the HE double hockey sticks is going on here? I hope you're wrong about this, but you don't think you are, eh?
Well, like I said, not in exactly the same way, but it's the question. Mm-hmm. One of the things, for example, on the abortion issue, it's always been about the rights of women to make decisions about their own bodies versus the rights of the unborn. And you can fall wherever you want on that continuum, and you can have whatever discussion you want to have about that. I don't want to opine on the issue of abortion. But at some point, there might be a situation in which the state comes forward and says, guess what? We have a right too. We have a right too, because that unborn child is our asset as well, because we need to deal with these types of issues. So we could see that moving not just from this, but also into issues like, gay rights and gay marriage and things that we thought were done that may come back as a result of this. So when Elon Musk said at the start of this show that this is one of the most significant issues that humanity is going to be confronting over the space of the next century, that hardly anybody is talking about, and thankfully you are, Steve, this is real.
John, I want to see whether or not science can help us out in any of this. We know that male and female fertility rates are a problem right now for too many people. Is science on the cusp of doing something there to improve the fertility rates of the genders?
If they are, I'm not aware of it. My background is not in science. My background, such as it is in studying societies and how they work and how politics works. I think the best hope for us might just be a change of attitude. I mean, again, the worst world is one in which signals get sent. So it's not Handmaid's Tale, but it's, do women really need all that much education? Surely a woman could have one or two children before her career takes off. Subtle hints inside the society that women really should, for the good of the greater society, buckle down and have a couple of kids. That, again, is a world I don't want to be a part of. But it may just be natural. It may just be we have a generation or two of only children who fall in love with another only child, and they say, you know what? I'll bet you it'd be great to have half a dozen kids running around on Christmas Day. Let's make that happen. I think we might naturally somehow reverse population decline just because we get tired of only having one or no kids. That would be the organic way of doing it, and it would take 2 or 3 generations.
And let me just get you to finish up, John, with this. You do spend a lot of time keeping an eye on governments, both here at home and around the world. Are governments adequately seized of this issue to want to do something about it?
Not here, they aren't. They certainly are in Eastern Asia. When we came up with Empty Planet, the first country outside Canada to buy rights was Korea, and then came Japan, and then came China, and then came the United States. So I think this is almost a generational divide between Eastern Asia and the Western societies. I don't think this is top of mind right now for governments in Ottawa or Washington or London. It is increasingly top of mind for governments in Eastern Europe because it's serious there. It may very well be top of mind in Moscow as well.
What do you see, Daryl, in terms of governments taking this issue seriously?
A lot of it right now is in denial because it's dominated by liberal technocratic people who are trying to find normal types of public policy solutions to these issues. And they still believe that if you can, it's a question of market failure, and that if you could create the right incentives, that people will do what we need them to do in order to preserve our societies. Except every governing instrument that they've applied to this has not really worked. I mean, it's improved a little bit, gone back then. It's not shown a continuous ability to resolve this situation. So at some point, what we're going to start moving to is a more fundamental conversation, and that's when it starts to get scary, as John mentioned.
Gentlemen, I want to thank both of you for your participation in tonight's program and for putting this on our agenda, because this is something we all need to think a lot more about and do something about. So people who are watching or listening, go have kids, right? Go have kids. John Ibbitson in the nation's capital, Daryl Bricker, Ipsos Public Affairs. Thanks to you both. At a certain point in most people's lives, they'll ask themselves the question, should we have children? There is a group of people who have an easy answer for you, regardless of your life circumstance. No, don't. In fact, they say it is your moral responsibility not to bring new life into this world. They're known as anti-natalists. And to help us understand this philosophy, let's welcome, in London, UK, Lawrence Anton. He runs a YouTube channel dedicated to anti-natalism and is the editor of the Anti-Natalist Handbook. And in Chicago, Illinois, Amanda Sukanek, host of the Exploring Anti-Natalism podcast and co-author of Anti-Natalism, Extinction and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. Okay, Lawrence and Amanda, I thank both of you for making time for us tonight here on TVO. I want to start with a quote from a 2006 book called Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. It's by philosopher David Benatar, and here's a quote from the book. Coming into existence, far from ever constituting a net benefit, always constitutes a net harm. Most people, under the influence of powerful biological dispositions towards optimism, find this conclusion intolerable. They are still more indignant at the further implication that we should not create people. Okay, Amanda, get us started here. Do you think it is immoral to have children?
Thank you, Steve. Yes, I think that it is unethical to procreate. What antinatalism essentially is preventative medicine. When we create new people, we set them up for all the risks of suffering in the world. And antinatalism is essentially the Hippocratic Oath. It's the fail-safe. It's the principle of doing no harm. Again, when we create new people, we set them up for all kinds of different risks of suffering, and we do so completely unnecessarily.
Lawrence, what is the core argument or insight about antinatalism?
So I think one of the core insights is that there's no one who exists before we exist to want to come into existence. And so when we do create someone, we're bringing them into a world that they didn't exist to have an interest in coming into. And it's a world that has a lot of suffering and harm in it that will be imposed on them to varying extents. And we could have simply just not created them in the first place and not exposed them to any harm and risk of harm.
Well, that does, I guess, pose a follow-up to Amanda, which is it the state of the world today in particular that drives this philosophy?
Well, I think certainly with the way that the world is now today, there certainly are many people coming to different decisions from all kinds of different motivations to not to have children. But what contemporary antinatalism is based on is not those reasons at all. So even though there are antinatalists that are motivated by the way our various economies are functioning today, the state of the environment, antinatalism, as Lawrence and I understand it, again, would be of an ethical concern.
Let me follow up, Amanda, with this. And admittedly, this is a ridiculous question, but you'll humor me as I ask it. What if we solve climate change? What if we solve poverty? What if we bring in an unprecedented amount of world peace? Would you still be arguing against bringing new life into the world?
Well, I certainly hope that we achieve all that. Let me just say that. I think that we have within our power to do a tremendous amount of good. We can alleviate all kinds of suffering. But I actually think that this world was never an adequate place to bring lives into. I think even with all of those terrible problems fully solved, there is still we are designed to not only feel all the pleasures of life, but we're also designed to feel all of the sufferings of life too. And none of that is going to go away, even if these problems are alleviated.
Well, in fact, Lawrence, my mother always used to say, no one gets through life scot-free. And by that, I know she meant there is untold suffering in this world, and we can do something about some of it and not much about a lot of it. But of course, we also experience great joys, great triumphs, great loves, beauty, awe, engagement, connection. I mean, the Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup in 1967. I mean, these were all unambiguously good things. Is it not a tragedy to miss out on all of that?
So obviously, once we're here, we have an interest in experiencing all of the things you've listed and the good things in life generally, right? So I agree. No anti-natalist is going to deny that once we're here, there are many things we can enjoy. But like I said before, one of the core insights is that before we exist, there's simply no one to come into existence. If I use you and me as an example, neither of us existed 100 years ago, and we didn't exist to care that we didn't exist at all. We weren't missing out on any of the good things 100 years ago, just like the child that I will never have doesn't exist and will never exist to miss out on the things happening now.
Are you not glad that you're here, though?
Well, it's a complicated question. So I don't have emotional lament over the fact that I'm here. I'm here now. I accept that. I try to have the best time I can and try and help others while I'm here as well. But I recognize that I wouldn't exist to care if I was never born, if that makes sense.
It does. Amanda, I'll follow up with the same question to you, but I want to set it up in a different way. This is a clip from the podcast that you do, and this is from Emma Shevchik. And she talks, well, I'll let her speak for herself, shall we? Sheldon, roll the clip if you would.
I have to say I'm not grateful for having been born, and I don't know why that never occurred to me before having children, that I'm not grateful to my parents for having had me.
What about you, Amanda? Are you grateful to be born?
Well, first of all, wonderful to see Emma there. But I am grateful for the love and the care and all the wonderful things that I have experienced in my life. I have many, many things in my life that I'm incredibly grateful for. I have people in my life that I love. I'm an artist. I'm a toy collector. I take great pleasure in all manner of things in life. But I'm not grateful for the fact that risks were taken with my sentient welfare. I'm not grateful for the fact that I, like all living things, will face a death at the end of my life journey. So life is not just one thing. It is not just all suffering. It is not all joy. But as Lawrence was essentially saying, before we're born, there is nobody in need of any of these things. Once we're put into existence, it's essentially a circumstance of creating need for absolutely no need, unnecessarily. There's nobody in purgatory screaming for a good life. There's no rescue mission at hand. We're not taking somebody out of nothing that is in need of anything. We are putting these needs into something that didn't need to exist in the first place.
Okay, Lawrence, back over to you. We quoted David Benatar off the top. I'm going to go to him again, the anti-natalist philosopher, who said life itself is, quote, permeated by badness. So it poses the obvious question, are you happy?
Yeah, so people are sometimes surprised when I say that and they're asking me within this sort of framing. And yeah, I mean, I'm very fortunate. If you take all of the people who have ever lived ever and all of the people who exist now, I am in one of the best situations that can be. I'm in an economically developed country. I have a supermarket and hospitals near me, all this sort of stuff. So in the grand scheme of things, I'm very privileged and I have a pretty content life. I enjoy myself. And I don't think that has any friction at all with being an anti-natalist, because like I said before, being an anti-natalist is just recognizing that there's no need to bring anyone into existence. We're not benefiting people by doing that because they don't exist to want to come here. But we are preventing or not imposing harm on new people by creating them.
Although, given your circumstances, if you had a child, there's every possibility your child would enjoy the same amount of happiness that you are currently experiencing. So what's wrong with giving that a shot?
Well, Amanda has referred to risk before. So, I mean, I could create someone. I don't see why I would do that because, like I said, there's no one who wants to come into existence. But if I did do that, of course, they could end up having a good life as I have. But I'm completely unnecessarily, like Amanda said, rolling the dice for that person. There are many people who were born in very similar conditions to me that didn't have as good a life as me and had quite awful lives. And you can never tell if the child you're going to create is going to be one of those people or not. And so it's just better when you're dealing with someone else, it's better to take the more cautious approach.
Amanda, admittedly, I've only known you for 10 minutes, but you seem to be a person with a rather sunny disposition. Are you a happy person?
I am a happy person. Listen, I've certainly had my struggles in life as anybody else. But like I said earlier, I take great joy out of my life. But I have to also say I'm only 41. I've made it pretty well so far. I have not yet experienced death. I mean, it's interesting that we never get to ask people this question after they have gone through the death process and, actually written the product review after the full purchase has been made, the purchase that was made for us. But yet we don't know who we're creating before we create somebody. So candy to me might taste like garbage to this new person. They are not going to be us. And so as an anti-natalist, I've made the decision to derive the happinesses in life from myself, from the other people that are here. And I think that people that are interested in having children really should ask themselves, what is it about your own existence that you're not being able to derive those goods from? Why can't we find it in ourselves? Why can't we find it in people already here? Why do we need to take risks with other people's lives that don't even exist yet just to fulfill something that we happen to be missing for whatever reason that might be?
Well, that's one possible explanation. The other possible explanation is, Amanda, you might have a child and that child may grow up to find the cure for cancer. Now, that'd be a good thing, wouldn't it?
They also might grow up to have cancer. So again, I wouldn't. There is no good that life could possibly have in life that would be worth my taking risks with their welfare for absolutely no reason. Again, I hope that there is a cure for cancer, but I hope that is solved by somebody who already exists. These things are needed by the living. They are not, it is not an appropriate roll of the dice to try to find those cures with beings that don't already exist, who may not thank you for signing them up for that task.
Lawrence, I wonder how you got to the position that you currently hold, because I think it's fair to say that most little kids, when they are little kids, think at some point in their life they're going to have a little kid. So when did you change your mind about that, if in fact that was the case?
Yeah, well, I used to want biological children, and I sort of viewed my future somewhat predominantly around the fact that I wanted to have children. I first came to this idea actually from just overhearing a conversation where the term was mentioned. And then I had a further conversation with some anti-natalists. And I basically just had like an open and honest exploration of the ideas with them, and went away and listened to a few interviews with people like David Benatar, who you've mentioned. And really from that point forward, I couldn't come up with any good arguments against it. And so I thought, well, I'm going to have to take this on, and it has implications for my actions. So I'm going to have to sort of change my future life plan, or potentially not, because obviously, anti-natalists can adopt. And yeah, that was how I came to it. And yeah.
How old were you at that time?
I was 20.
20. So that was a while ago.
Yeah, I'm 27 now. Yeah.
Oh, then not that long ago. Okay. Amanda, Amanda, since of the three of us, you're the only one who can, I think, actually have a child. I wonder whether you, at some point in your life, maybe when you were younger, wanted to have kids and changed your mind.
Nope. No, I have never wanted children. The idea has always, I've always been rather allergic to the idea, in fact. This is one of the arguments that the Finnish philosopher Matti Haira and I have sort of developed, the argument from imposition. There's many different versions of the argument for imposition, but essentially the one that we have developed is that, when we have children, one of the things that we impose on those young lives is this expectation to have children. And there is sort of a cultural mandate that is the course that their lives are going to take. And there are repercussions if lives don't necessarily take those routes. If you don't have a positive opinion of procreation, it might affect your relationship with your parents, who may have certain expectations. It might affect the kind of opinions you can say in polite society. It might affect the kind of friends that you have. So it's a freedom that is really not extended to the young to have a more of a different opinion about procreation, to critique procreation. And I think that is essentially what antinatalism allows for. And people are finding this idea at a younger and younger age. So I think that as time goes on, it's very likely that younger people will be able to, they are to some degree doing it now, but I think as time goes on, more and more young people will have less of a rosy idea of this being their future. Well,
let me try this idea with Lawrence. Lawrence, I'm twice your age plus 10. So I guess I am hearkening back right now to the time when I was 27, and I think to myself, some of the things I believed back then, I don't necessarily believe anymore. So are you open to the possibility that 27 is still a fairly tender age in this life, and that you might change your mind about this at some point in the future? Do you allow for that possibility?
Yeah, of course. Look, everyone, if we all know one thing about humans, it's that they can get things wrong. If history teaches us anything, it's that. So I'm completely open to the possibility that I could have my mind changed, or I could naturally change my mind over time. And if that happens, then so be it. If there are better arguments out there that convince me, then I'm completely open to those. And in the future, I already referenced before that, anti-natalism is not in conflict with adoption. And I see adoption as a very virtuous thing. There's someone who already exists and is in need of love and support, and they need someone to provide that to them. And, I can, if I decide that I would, want to raise a child, then I would go that route, even if I became convinced that having biological children was morally okay, just because even if I was convinced that it was morally okay, I still think it would be better to adopt someone because they already exist.
Yeah, I take your point. Amanda, how about for you? You're a little older than Lawrence, but still younger than me. Can you imagine changing your mind on this at some point in life?
Yeah, well, listen, I think that, I was exactly Lawrence's age when I came into this subject, by the way. And also, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons, behind doing something like the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. I don't want to speak for Lawrence, but I mean, he and I both are constantly talking to new people about this subject. And I think one of the reasons is, right, like we're constantly interested in hearing new arguments. New people that maybe can challenge some of these ideas. I've talked to hundreds, if not thousands of people at this point about this subject. And so far, nobody has really made a dent in the cement of antinatalism. But it's built a very, strong house within my mind. But I am always, my mind is always open for things to penetrate.
Okay.
That.
Lawrence, again, not meant to be a smart-ass question, not at all, but just a natural question. Have you ever held a baby?
Yeah, yeah. I think it would be very hard to get to 27 years old and not have held a baby.
Okay, just checking. And did it not cause you pause to rethink your views?
No, because, when you're holding a baby, if that is a pleasant experience for you, then it's simply you having some form of connection or experience with another person. So, and obviously we all, or I can't say all, but many of us thrive on human connection, being around others, whether they're babies or not. And, that is, again, it's not in conflict with antinatalism, and, enjoying the connection of another human being is not necessarily something that should lead you to do something that you view as immoral. We can think that babies are, warm and cuddly and cute, but also recognize that, procreation is still morally wrong.
Understood. Okay, we got less than 5 minutes to go here, and let me try this. Amanda, I'll start with you on this one. I've talked to environmentalists who believe that the presence of humans on this planet is ultimately injurious to the planet, that the planet itself would be a lot better off if there were no humans on it. And there's a pretty good case to be made for that if you look at what we're doing these days. Do you believe that the moral endpoint for your position is to have no humans at all on the earth?
Yes. Well, actually, my moral endpoint is to have no life on the earth, but different antinatalists are going to have different ideas about that. Not all antinatalism is focused on human extinction or otherwise. There are also antinatalists like David Pierce who are interested in, bioengineering life so that it no longer experiences suffering. There are also antinatalists who are interested in the ideas about life extension. So we would live for extended period of time, but we would the catch to that is we would no longer have children. But yes, I mean, I think antinatalism, as I have always understood it, is an extinctionist philosophy, and we would stop having children and just quietly, in the most peaceful way possible, exit. Now, my motivations for that is again not environmentalist. It is not in the hopes of saving the planet from human harm, which is absolutely real. But again, that human beings and other life forms are sensitive, sentient creatures, and that once we exist, we are vulnerable to experiencing suffering.
And Lawrence, how about you? Is the ultimate aim of your movement no life on this planet at all?
So personally, I don't think that a specific end goal is really like the main focus of antinatalism. I think that it's just a critique of an action that obviously we have to admit in practice, if everyone stopped having children, obviously humans would fade out. But I don't necessarily think that has to be the end goal. It's more about the ethics of the actions that we're doing now. And if the consequence of that is extinction, then I think we should happily accept that, unless someone raises a good argument as to why that would be an extremely bad thing.
Okay. Amanda, last word to you on this. There are a lot of smart people out there who believe that not population explosion, but rather quite the contrary, population decline which is particularly acute in Western countries right now, could make this world a much worse place. It will be a much more difficult place to live as the populations decline, and the suffering that could engender after that. Fair to say that you think, at the very least, population decline would be a good thing for this world?
Well, I think that it's good that for whatever reasons people are not having children, the fact that they're not producing new lives is a good thing. It does mean less suffering in the world, at least in that sense. But we are ruled by, our governments, our collective governments, our societies are not on the same page that would allow for a decline in population to proceed without extra helpings of suffering, let's say that. Like if we lived in societies where growth was not the obsession, and we, if our governments would basically see, okay, people want to start procreating less, let's start scaling certain things back. A lot could be done to prevent some of those walls being hit, by less of us coming into existence, let's say. So again, I think it's a good thing that people are producing less people, but I also think that it, certainly they're not producing less people with the ideas of, something like extinction in mind, but none of that is happening in any sort of way that will actually prevent some of the worst scenarios, I think.
Yet is what some other people would say to that. I want to thank the two of you for coming onto our program. I know these views are not popular in some circles, but I hope you agree. We've had a respectful and civilized discussion about it here, and I thank Lawrence Anton from London, UK, and Amanda Sukanik from Chicago, Illinois, for appearing on TVO with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. Journalist and author John Lawrence joins us tomorrow to discuss his new memoir, No Jews Live Here, and we hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.